Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and I believe good evening to Dr. Liu. Before we start, may I take this time to remind everyone of our house rules for today's event. To our participants, kindly mute your microphone when not speaking to avoid disruptive noise. During the Q&A, please use the chat box function and kindly type in your questions briefly and clearly. Questions given during the registration have been collated and may be discussed. Participants are requested to virtually remain in the webinar until the end of the program. We also would like to remind you that the webinar will be recorded for documentation. Participants are not allowed to do so. If you have any concerns or inquiries, you may send a direct message to our tech team. Lastly, please continue to observe proper decorum throughout the session. As for data privacy, the organizers strive to ensure a high level of security for your personal data. The organizers will comply with the Philippines Data Privacy Act as to data that was gathered as part of the registration process during this event and the evaluation. Okay, so good morning again to everyone who have joined us for today. It is a great pleasure to see a lot of folks here, and welcome to the EconSecurity Talks Series, where today's focus will be on China's global ambitions and its sovereign wealth funds, lessons for the Philippines. My name is Aaron Jed Rabena, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's webinar. And today's webinar is brought to you by Facts Asia, Amador Research Services, Foundation for the National Interest, and Miriam College. And to officially open the session, may we call on Ambassador Laura Del Rosario, the president of Miriam College, for the welcome remarks. Ma'am, the screen is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. I wish to greet everybody a pleasant good morning or good evening, as the case may be. And we are really proud to be part of this endeavor with the Amador Research Services, Foundation for National Interest, and of course, Facts Asia. And of course, at Miriam College, we have our own advocacies really in making our students more aware of what is happening nationally, regionally, and of course, globally. When the current administration announced its plan to establish a sovereign wealth fund, many were aghast with a collective, what? Is that going to happen? What for? You know, there was an intense debate and there was a strong pushback, as we call it, a strong opposition to the idea, because many were not sure whether we have enough funds to spare, whether we are astute enough in our investment, what we call know-how. What if we lose those funds that might be taken from other sources, from government entities? And we thought that it was too much of a risk. So for today, we are glad that there is somebody with an expertise on sovereign wealth funds. So we're really happy that it's happening at this time of the year, when perhaps another year might usher in another discussion on this as we move towards, it seems, towards an unavoidable implementation maybe of an idea. At least that's what we perceive, that the president is really intent in pursuing this. Although the discussion really is on sovereign wealth funds, let us look at the difference. For one thing, China has hundreds of billions of dollars to spare. So it can afford to make little mistakes here and there, and it will recover. And of course, at the same time, with the vast funds that it has, it can also use its earnings for various purposes to elevate more, again, to elevate more the economic and financial standing of its country and of its people. But I do not want to a preemptive conclusion because I'm sorry I haven't read the work of our speaker. So thank you for this opportunity to be part of this. And so I welcome everybody to this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador Ma'am, for your insightful remarks and for setting the tone for today's event. For everyone, today's webinar aims to take a deep dive into sovereign wealth funds, their distinction, objectives, and how the Philippines could learn from them. And I believe I must also say that today is something exceptional because when we talk of China in the Philippines, we've mostly heard about the West Philippine Sea. But this time around, we're going to hear something economic about China and perhaps how China uses economic statecraft. And so we are very honored and grateful to being joined by an expert who has published a book on this topic about sovereign wealth funds. Now, to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Zongyuan Zoe Liu is the Maurice R. Greenberg Fellow for China Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. She also did her postdoctoral research at the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and at the Columbia Harvard China in the World program. She received her PhD from the Paul H. Nitz School of Advanced International Studies, or SAIS, at Johns Hopkins University. Before joining the CFR, Dr. Liu was an instructional assistant at Texas A&M's Bush School of Government and Public Service in Washington, D.C., where she taught the underlying principles in global economy, economic statecraft, and Chinese foreign policy. Dr. Liu also taught Asian energy and political risks analysis at SAIS in Johns Hopkins. Her research interests focus mainly on the workings of the international political economy, sovereign wealth funds, comparative politics, finance development, and energy and climate policy, with East Asia as her area of expertise. Most recently, she has published a book titled Sovereign Funds: How the Communist Party of China Finances Its Global Ambitions. So without further ado, let us all give a very warm welcome to Dr. Zongyuan Zoe Liu. Dr. Liu, the virtual screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aaron Rabina, for your kind introduction. And also very much thank you for Ambassador Laura Rosario for your agenda setting introductory remarks. Before I started talking my presentation, I just wanted to say that it's truly a great honor and pleasure to have this opportunity to engage with Philippine experts and researchers who are actually very much have deep expertise on the issues of sovereign funds yourselves. So it's really I look forward to the conversation. I was thinking about should I prepare a PowerPoint? Then I decided no, because part of that is because if we think about who has the latest or the newest sovereign wealth fund in the world, it's the Philippines. So from that perspective, I would say, well, I would want this to be more of a conversation rather than sort of a academic seminar. Now, so as I share my research, please feel free to jump in and raise questions if you have any. Now, I think I would want to make a couple of points. The first, I will begin with an analysis of what I think are some distinctive features of the political economy of China's sovereign funds. That would be my first point. And then my second point would zoom in on how, since President Xi Jinping came into power as the president of China in 2013, how he has used China's sovereign funds to achieve some of his and the Communist Party of China's global ambitions. And then finally, I would want to conclude by discussing certain policy relevant issues specifically for the United States and for the Philippines. Now, in terms of the political economy of China's sovereign wealth fund, you probably noticed that I did not, the book of the title of the book is not China's sovereign wealth fund, but sovereign funds. And there is a reason for that. And the reason is because China, I make the argument to say that, and my research shows that China's sovereign funds are different from the rest of the majority sovereign wealth fund out there, in the sense that it is China's sovereign funds are sovereign leveraged fund rather than capitalized by unencumbered commodity wealth. Now, let me take a step back and explain what that means. Right now, if we think about the world whole landscape of sovereign funds, right now, as of today, sovereign funds globally collectively manage something or close to $12 trillion in asset. And these funds are predominantly based in commodity exporting economies, and we are capitalized by revenues from the monetization of natural resources, notably oil and gas or fossil fuels. Now, in this particular context, the world's first sovereign fund would be was the Kuwaiti Investment Authority, established back in 1953, obviously from oil revenues. And then today, our newest sovereign wealth fund in this category would be the Maharlika Investment Fund, or the MIF, which is the Philippines' first ever sovereign wealth fund. And if we think about who is the largest in terms of asset under management, it would be China's China Investment Corporation, or the so-called CIC, based in Beijing. And it now is the world leading sovereign wealth fund in the world. As of last year, CIC surpassed the Norwegian sovereign funds, the so-called government pension fund of Norway, and became the largest sovereign funds in the world. As of the end of 2022, CIC has, under its asset in terms of asset under management, CIC controls more than $1.35 trillion. And that is bigger than the GDP of Mexico, or the world's 15th largest, which was the world's 15th largest economy. So from that perspective, China is unique in the sense that how could this country, China being the world's largest commodity importing economy, has one of the world's largest sovereign funds? So that was actually the leading question that motivated me to do research on this subject. Now, in my book, I did make the argument to say that the evolution of China's sovereign funds has unfolded against the bigger context of China's domestic financial reform and the globalization of China's capital. No other country in history has so rapidly transformed its economy from being among the world's poorest and perhaps one of the most isolated one to now the world's second largest economy, at the heart of the global supply chain, and a leading source of international investment and capital. So in this whole transformation, China's sovereign funds actually played a significant role in China's economy, from mitigating financial crisis at home to tempering exogenous shocks. And a lot of China's sovereign funds have supported China's industrial policies by financing the state procurement of strategic overseas assets, bankrolling Chinese enterprises' mergers and acquisitions overseas. And they also supported the development of indigenous Chinese technology startups, including one of China's earliest semiconductor investment fund. So basically, the story of China's sovereign funds really is a story about the globalization of China's state-owned capital and the globalization of China's influence. Again, let me now specifically explain why China's sovereign funds are different from traditional commodity-based sovereign wealth fund. And they are different because China's approaches to sovereign funds in terms of where the money comes from is really different. Because again, traditional sovereign wealth fund, the money comes from the monetization of natural resources, whereas the source of China's sovereign funds really comes from foreign exchange reserves. And by law, foreign exchange reserves are not supposed to either invest at home or to be used for risky investment. Because if you look at how IMF defines foreign exchange reserves, the definition is that the foreign exchange reserves are those managed by the monetary authority for the purpose of balance of payment, and the management of foreign exchange reserves are supposed to be invested in liquid and low risk assets. In other words, the moment when foreign exchange reserves move outside of the monetary authority, or they are used for risk-bearing purposes investment rather than safe assets such as U.S. treasuries, then these are no longer foreign exchange reserves. And if you look at PBOC, the People's Bank of China officials' speeches or press releases, you actually see that this is also how they explain China's foreign exchange reserves. Now, the experience of China leveraging its foreign exchange reserves actually shows that a state without significant natural resource revenues can take leverage, either explicit or implicit, to source the seed capital for the funding of what I call sovereign leverage fund. And I'll just give you an example how whole thing started. Since I mentioned that China Investment Corporation, or CIC, is now the largest sovereign fund in the world, I'll just explain how the fund was established originally. The fund was established back in 2007, and the source of money was not from oil revenue, right? But from the Ministry of Finance issue special purpose bond, and then use the bond proceed to purchase foreign exchange reserves from the People's Bank of China in the amount of $200 billion, and then use that money to capitalize CIC. Yeah, in other words, the creation of a China Investment Corporation involves the state expanding its balance sheet because Ministry of Finance issued debt, right? And the source of money ultimately comes from China's foreign exchange reserves. And then remember, the moment when this $200 billion of foreign exchange reserve moved outside of the People's Bank of China and deposit on the book of CIC, the newly established CIC in 2007, those are no longer foreign exchange reserves. In other words, through the process of creating CIC, China's foreign exchange reserves actually decreased. And then that is sort of the explicit part. The implicit part really comes down to the various funds established under China's foreign exchange reserve management arm called SAFE, or State Administration of Foreign Exchange. Now, different from the process of creating CIC, the implicit leverage basically means instead of the fiscal authority issue special purpose bond, SAFE basically recharacterized the risk profile of foreign exchange reserves managed by itself and use part of its previously or supposedly low risk bearing foreign exchange to invest in risk bearing assets. Now, in this whole process, again, the risk bearing investment is no longer counted towards foreign exchange reserves. So from that perspective, here in the study of capital flows, there is this huge dilemma why China's trade surplus or current account surplus continues to expand, but its foreign exchange reserves seems to be stabilized around slightly above $3 trillion. There are different ways that people can explain it. One way to understand it is that instead of SAFE channeling the money on the side of official foreign exchange reserves, it deposited on the other side, which is varieties of investment. Sorry? Good. All right.
Yeah,
If all
please,
good.
please go ahead, Dr. Liu. Again, we remind everyone to please be on mute mode. Okay, so that.
Sure, no problem. Okay, so now sort of, now you understand there is the explicit versus implicit leverage, right? Then economically, I would argue that the use of either explicit or implicit leverage over foreign exchange reserves, again, they decrease the stock of foreign exchange reserve assets that can be counted towards foreign exchange reserves as defined by the IMF, right? So if you ask me what are the most important distinction between these two approaches to establish sovereign funds, I would say it's really the accounting treatment and how much the general public are aware of its existence. And I remember doing field research in China back in 2016, getting into the cabbie in Beijing. Perhaps many of us who are familiar with China, or you ever, you ever took a taxi in Beijing or Shanghai, you realize actually the taxi drivers in China or in Beijing and Shanghai in particular, they were particularly chatty. So when I got into the cab back in 2016, and I said I wanted to go to Baoli Dasha, which is the headquarters of the China Investment Corporation (CIC), and then my cab driver started to say, "Why you are going there?" And he basically, obviously, that is not a question. He basically started launching his complaint about the CIC. He said, this investment, the China Investment Corporation lost a lot of money during global financial crisis, and he used the term traitor in the sense that losing money on behalf of the Chinese people. And from his perspective, he has a sense of ownership of those money. Whereas when you think about SAFE and a lot of the investment managed by China, by the foreign exchange reserve management arm of the PBOC, very few people are aware of it, even if aware of its existence. So from that perspective, perhaps there is a reason for SAFE's various investment funds choose not to be very transparent. And now that's the part of why I argue China's sovereign funds are leveraged fund rather than in the same way of traditional commodity funds like Norwegians or Abu Dhabi Investment Authority and things like that, right? Now let me move to my second point: how President Xi Jinping sort of used China's foreign exchange reserve to capitalize the sovereign leverage fund differently. Since the ascendance of President Xi Jinping to China's top leadership, within the party back in 2012, and then officially became the president in 2013. A hallmark of his policy has been the Belt and Road Initiative. So a very important transformation between before Xi Jinping and after Xi Jinping is that China's foreign exchange reserves actually has been channeled to finance a lot of this BRI project, directly or indirectly. According to there's this person, the director of the SAFE's Foreign Exchange Reserve Management Center, since 2013, the party has used the foreign exchange reserves to replenish Okay. Are we good now?
Yes.
All right.
Sorry about that, Dr. Liu.
Yeah, no
Please go
problem.
ahead.
Yeah, no problem. So basically, where I was just now was that the director of a SAFE official basically publicly acknowledged that since 2013, the year when Xi Jinping came into power, the party has used the foreign exchange reserves to replenish China's policy banks, which many of us are familiar, including China Development Bank, China Import and Export Bank of China, and things like that. In other words, a lot of these news headline state-owned financial institutions, policy banks, they are actually, the fact how they became so big is because the Chinese party state used the foreign exchange reserve to recapitalize their balance sheet. And in addition to capitalize policy banks, the Chinese government also established several new sovereign funds using foreign exchange reserves, including the Silk Road Fund and China Latin America Production Capacity Cooperation Fund, China Africa Infrastructure Capacity Cooperation Fund, as well as China National Investment Corporation. So series of that seems the rollout of CIC. And some SWF officials have also identified 3 areas where foreign exchange reserves can be strategically used to serve China's national strategies. Now here, these are not the politicians, right? The important part to note here is that these are monetary authority officials. Unlike, if you ask monetary authority officials, say in Argentina, they would be, or in China for a long period of time, people would tell you that, or at least people tell me that, money in the central bank could be there one day and then out the other day, the next day. So they tend to be very conservative. They do not want to use foreign exchange reserves to invest in risky asset. And that's also the scenario why IMF said, foreign exchange reserve management should be invested in liquid and risk-free asset. But here you go. You have monetary authorities officials to say, well, there are different ways. They identified different areas, 3 different areas where foreign exchange reserves have been used strategically to serve national strategies. The first one is that they created policy banks and sovereign funds, and the creation of these institutions provide a sustainable mechanism to put China's foreign exchange reserves to work in service of national strategies. And from their point of view, these are reserve diversifications. So could this be justified? I would say yes, specifically because China has this problem where perhaps many other countries don't have, which is China has more than $3 trillion of foreign exchange reserves that became too much to manage. Now, if you have a lot of investment, people understand this, which is if you have too much cash, you create this cash drag, you incur opportunity cost. That is not necessarily good because you can invest in other opportunities that generate higher yield or higher return. And actually, that was the original motivation. In other words, to reduce opportunity cost, reduce cash drag. That was the original motivation for China to have this domestic debate in terms of how to better manage foreign exchange reserves. So again, to begin with, China did not start establishing sovereign wealth fund or sovereign leverage fund, as I define it. China did not start establishing this fund with a giant strategic motivation, right? A lot of this is starting to change since President Xi Jinping came to power. So that's the first area. And then secondly, according to the PBOC official, using China's foreign exchange reserves for international investment and cooperation can also advance China's participation in global governance and create a favorable international environment for the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, see, here, the second point is that you use the money for investment and for cooperation so that you can shape international financial governance. So this becomes, to what extent money can buy influence and can shape norms. Then the third part, the PBOC official also asserted that strengthening the party's leadership and corporate governance can also discipline equity investment institutions and drive convergence towards a professional management standard that will ultimately serve China's national strategies. Now here, the third part is, again, through investment management, by emphasizing the party's leadership over a lot of this corporate governance to strengthen the party's leadership, in addition to, personnel management. And ultimately, this would serve China's national strategy, right? So a lot of these things are not just a singular. You see President Xi Jinping has been emphasizing not just the party's leadership over SOEs, but the party's leadership over financial governance. And recently, people started to get a little bit paranoid, saying that why recently Xi Jinping announced that on the one hand, there is a central finance the party's central finance work instead of a national finance conference. People started to overinterpret, saying that why Xi Jinping is centralizing the party's control over finance. Actually, it already started way before, right? Because since he came into power, he already emphasized that the party should stress its leadership and over not just SOEs, not just personnel management, but also capital management. And he even sort of advocated that China's the overall architecture that regulates or governs the Chinese state-owned enterprise called SASAC, or the State-Owned Asset Supervision and Administration Commission. This is the overarching institution governing close to 100 centrally owned, the most important, strategically important state-owned enterprises. So basically, under Xi Jinping's leadership, he emphasized that SASAC need to focus on the management of a capital and a finance. And again, this started back in November 2013, the first year since he came into power. And after he laid out his vision for China's economy for the first time at the third plenary session of the, I think at that time it would be the 18th Party Central Committee. At that time, he basically laid out that this is what we are going to do, which is emphasizing the party's leadership over financial governance, emphasize that SASAC need to focus on focus on managing capital. So basically, in effect, Xi Jinping is sort of a double down on China's sovereign leverage fund model. He basically proposed that state-owned capital investment companies are following the Chinese sovereign leverage fund model, and they are mandated to focus on financing development in state prioritized strategic sectors like aviation, like energy, like mineral resources, nuclear power, shipping, logistics, and so on and so forth. And starting from 2014, in July, SASAC began to sort of implementing and self-reform, figuring out what it is going to do. And it was exactly the person who governed CIC before, which is also at that time also Finance Minister Lou Jiwei. He was the founding chairman of CIC, and he was the person now in charge of fleshing out the details of President Xi Jinping's vision in terms of how to reform and improve the SASAC system in terms of capital management. Now, perhaps Xi Jinping's signature project would be the Belt and Road Initiative, and has he created a special fund to finance Belt and Road Initiative? Yes, of course he has. You know, in addition to all these policy banks, the Silk Road Fund is the BRI financing fund. In that perspective, the Silk Road Fund is actually relatively unique among China's sovereign leverage fund complex, because many other funds like CIC and others, or for that matter, the very first time when they tried to leverage foreign exchange reserves, that was to create central Huijin to solve a domestic banking crisis. You know, again, a lot of this did not start with strategic vision, but the Silk Road Fund was created specifically to finance the Belt and Road Initiative. So from that perspective, Xi Jinping, since he came into power, a lot of this has transformed. Now, as China's monetary authority or the PBOC governors and deputy governors going along with this, yes, they have. So obviously, you know, when the Silk Road Fund was first established, it received an initial $10 billion capital injection. And then at one of those Belt and Road forums for international cooperation, Xi Jinping committed an additional renminbi, additional $100 billion in renminbi to, in addition, as additional capital into the Silk Road Fund. And the next day after his commitment, at that time, the deputy governor of the PBOC, Yi Gang, who later became the governor of the PBOC, he endorsed the plan the day after President Xi Jinping's announcement. And Yigang called that, well, this commitment very important, is necessary, and is timely to expand the Silk Road Fund capital. So from that perspective, this is when I talk with monetary economists and financial experts about debating the issue of the central bank independency. Nobody ever told me that central bank independency is something that is debatable in the context of China, because it's not necessarily there. And then now I talked about how China's sovereign funds are different and how Xi Jinping transformed it. Then finally, what does this mean for the rest of the world? Again, I wanted to end by saying that the whole process that China established the sovereign leverage fund shows that not sovereign funds as government-owned financial institutions, they are no longer the luxury of commodity exporting economies anymore. Actually, even those commodity exporting economies started to leverage their existing oil wealth or leverage their own sovereign wealth fund by issuing debt to achieve domestic development purposes. And you see this with Saudi Arabia's PIF, Public Investment Fund. And you also see this in UAE, the series of funds from Mubadala Investment Corporation to Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, and a series of those. So from that perspective, I do think that it's as long as the management capacity is there, as long as the investment, the investment expertise and the professionalism is there, it is not necessarily a bad idea to have a government-owned investment institution to capitalize or crowd in both domestic and international investment into strategic sectors that can build up industrial policies and industrial base in a small economy like the Philippines. And this is actually, a very good example could be Mubadala, or for that matter, China's whole experience. The problem is that to what extent these funds could become the source of money financing politicians' own pet project. That is a big question. And I think Ambassador Laura Rosario already pointed that out. So this basically means in order to make sure that these funds are governed properly, you need two things. One is professionalism, but professionalism is not enough. You also need transparency. And transparency, while transparency does not necessarily directly guarantee accountability, but without transparency, obviously there would not be accountability. So I guess I'll just stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Dr. Liu, for your very comprehensive and insightful comments on China's sovereign wealth funds. I believe, taking it from you, you classified Chinese sovereign wealth funds as sovereign leveraged funds. So maybe we can say that these are sovereign wealth funds with Chinese characteristics. And I would actually agree. Essentially, if these are being used to accumulate economic power, I'm not surprised, because other elements of or instruments of national power draws from economic power, like military power, diplomatic power, institutional power, and even public diplomacy efforts draw from economic power. Yeah, and so it's great for the Philippine policy community to hear from you, really, Dr. Liu. And we hope that someday soon we'll have you here in Manila also to give another talk. And
I'd love that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. So now that we have been given a detailed account of how China utilizes its sovereign funds, let's call in our reactors. We have 3, and they will be given 10 minutes each to discuss their views and offer insights on what the Philippines can learn from, considering that we in the Philippines recently passed a law appropriating funds for or creating the Maharlika Investment Fund. Okay, so our first reactor is Dr. Giancarlo or JC Punong Bayan. Dr. JC Punong Bayan is an assistant professor at the University of the Philippines School of Economics or UPSE. He graduated summa cum laude from the UPSE in 2009 and was given the Encarnacion Junior Award for Excellence in Economics and the Gerardo P. Sicat Award for Best Undergraduate Thesis. He also earned his MA degree at the same university, where he taught lessons in microeconomics, macroeconomics, development economics, and Philippine economic history. He earned his PhD in UPSE in October 2021. He also served as head executive assistant on the National Economic and Development Authority and has experiences working for notable organizations like the Philippine Center for Economic Development, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the World Bank Office in Manila, the Asia Foundation, the Energy Policy and Development Program, the Philippine Competition Commission, and the FEU Public Policy Center. So Dr. Punong Bayan is also a practitioner. Okay, so Dr. JC, may we now give you the virtual floor.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss Dr. Liu's excellent presentation. Very interesting, and I look forward to reading the book soon. So it's very illuminating to hear about the perspectives about China's sovereign wealth funds. And my contribution, I think, this morning is to talk about the Philippine experience so far with the newly established Maharlika Investment Fund. And drawing from Dr. Liu's presentation, at least one similarity that I can spot is that the Maharlika Investment Fund is also not coming from commodity wealth in the normal sense or in the usual sense of traditional sovereign wealth funds. In fact, in a discussion paper that was published by the UP School of Economics, authored by 21 faculty members, including myself, we argued that the Maharlika Investment Fund is not a sovereign wealth fund in a true sense, but instead a strategic investment fund, in the sense that it has goals of investing in financial instruments on the one hand, and on the other hand, also trying to invest in national projects, mainly infrastructure. But just like China's biggest sovereign wealth fund, Maharlika draws its capital not from commodity wealth, but instead from the capital of state-owned banks, such as the Land Bank of the Philippines, as well as the Development Bank of the Philippines, net earnings from the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, our own monetary authority, as well as proceeds from privatization and other sources coming from the national government. And I think this is a crucial first point because unlike China, which has accumulated tons of current account surpluses, especially in the 2000s and the early 2010s, the Philippines has actually a growing budget deficit and, in fact, a growing debt as well. During the pandemic, debt to GDP ratio rose to more than 60%, and we are having a bit of a difficulty bringing it down. But suffice it to say that we don't have excess funds at the moment, and certainly we don't have excess funds to invest for such an ambitious strategic investment fund. And I think Ambassador Laura hit the nail on its head earlier by alluding to the point that the trick for many successful sovereign wealth funds or strategic investment funds, or as Dr. Liu mentioned, sovereign leverage fund, is that you have to have enough money to begin with. Because if you're making investments globally as well as domestically and expecting some decent return, then at least you must have that buffer so that if you incur losses down the line, then at least you can survive it. But in the case of the Philippines, the opportunity costs of getting money from state-owned banks, for example, is quite high, in the sense that the Land Bank of the Philippines and the Development Bank of the Philippines both have mandates of spurring countrywide and rural development. And in fact, many bankers and economists are pointing to the problem that these state-owned banks will no longer be able to meet their capital adequacy ratios because they have been instructed and forced by the Maharlika Investment Fund law to give up a total of 75 billion pesos for the purpose of Maharlika seed capital. There's also, so in other words, in short, the Maharlika Investment Fund is robbing the opportunity for these state-owned banks to lend to farmers, fisher folk, cooperatives, etc. And that will have an enormous cost in boosting rural development. There's also a huge opportunity cost of getting from the net earnings of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. And in fact, initially, they tried to get money from the international reserves of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, which is a huge no-no. In modern central banking, you don't just touch international reserves just like that. And in fact, the Philippines serves as a good illustration of why that should not be done in the first place. Because during martial law in the 70s and 80s, there was no independence of the old Central Bank of the Philippines, and it was instructed by the dictator, the father of the current president, Ferdinand Marcos Sr., to lend to many of the cronies, family, and friends of the dictator. In the end, the Central Bank of the Philippines lost money to the tune of 300 billion pesos in 1980s money. It's quite ironic that the Central Bank of the Philippines should lose such huge amounts, considering that it has the ability and, in fact, the monopoly to print money. But there you go. We have a situation where the Philippines illustrates the pitfalls of lack of independence or even touching international reserves. So there was a huge pushback against the idea of getting international reserves to form part of Maharlika's seed capital. And initially, if you remember, there was also a push to get money from pension funds as well, which also got a lot of backlash. So in the beginning, there was a huge confusion about why there should be a Maharlika investment fund in the first place in the absence of a surplus funds. Certainly nowhere near the surplus funds that have been accumulated by China over decades. I mean, that's a very crucial first point to make, I think. As I mentioned earlier, there's a huge opportunity cost, and there's a lot of confusion about where does the Maharlika Investment Fund play, or what role does it play in the overall national development program of the government, since it's nowhere to be found, for example, in the Philippine Development Plan. I think Dr. Liu was also extremely correct in pointing out the point about professionalism and transparency, because economists have also pointed many red flags about Maharlika Investment Fund, about the lack of independence, for example, or all board of directors members of Maharlika Investment Corporation will be appointed by the president. And among many other things, it also lacks a proper risk management framework. There are many other issues when it comes to transparency and accountability when it comes to the Maharlika Investment Fund. There are, for example, in the recent implementing rules and regulations, they also made certain adjustments, seemingly to accommodate certain people to appoint them in the Maharlika Investment Corporation's board, and in fact, the first president and CEO as well. They relaxed some of those qualifications, and many have also pointed out red flags when it comes to that. There's a lot of confusion about why this is being done right now, and what are the true motivations. And I think Dr. Liu also very rightly pointed out that we should avoid Maharlika, for example, being used to finance many projects and business interests of politicians. In the Senate deliberations, I remember there was a 3-page business proposal that was submitted by the economic managers trying to justify the need for Maharlika. And some of the projects that they listed that Maharlika might invest in include mixed-use properties and real estate properties. And it so happens that the primary proponent of Maharlika in the Senate is affiliated or known to or belongs to a clan that has huge real estate projects throughout the country. So there are many questions, and there are certainly too few guardrails or safeguards to ensure that Maharlika's investments, especially since it is investing public funds, if you think of it, should not fall in the hands of select few politicians who might enrich themselves in the process. And I think we should all be vigilant about the next steps regarding the Maharlika Investment Corporation, and also the fact that even the first president CEO admitted that it may take decades before they reap any benefits or returns. But in the meantime, there are so many things that we should be spending on, more urgent things like education, health. So the opportunity costs of putting public funds into that Maharlika Investment Fund are so high, and maybe many economists are saying that maybe it's better used if you put that money instead on more immediate government projects and programs. So I think that's it. Looking forward to more exchanges later on, and I'll certainly make sure to have a copy of Dr. Liu's book very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. JC, for voicing out those risks and challenges that we need to take into account in the wake of the establishment of the Maharlika Investment Fund. Now, for our second reactor is Dr. Jason Lamchek. Dr. Jason Lamchek is a senior lecturer at the University of the Philippines, Manila, and is a research fellow at Deakin Law School and the Cybersecurity Collaborative Research Center. He also worked as an attorney in the Philippines, which includes the Public Interest Law Center and the National Resources Center. During his work at the PILC, he helped campaign against the war on terror in the Philippines and represented individuals falsely accused of terrorism. His current research tackles the correlation of human rights and new technology. In his stay at the CSCRC, he analyzes the ethics of cybersecurity research and technology development, along with the cyber-mediated changes in society. He is also a recipient of the Erasmus Mundus Scholarship, European Commission, by the European Commission, and the Monboka Gakusho Scholarship by the Japanese government. He finished his PhD at the Australian National University. So let us all please welcome Dr. Jason Lamchek. Sir, please go ahead.
Thanks, Aaron. So let me preface my reaction by saying that I'm not an economist, I'm not a finance expert, unlike my fellow reactors here, Dr. JC Panungbayan, Mr. Alex Escucha, and also Dr. Zoe Liu. So economics is not my native tongue. My background is that of a lawyer, happens to be interested in issues to do with the distribution of economic wealth and political power. My reaction today is drawn from a recently published article co-authored with a colleague where we examined how to make sovereign wealth funds work in the context of countries riddled with corruption. So that's where I'm coming from. I congratulate Dr. Liu for such an excellent and thought-provoking presentation. Given that China is a global power, everyone can always use new knowledge about China, especially its ambitions on the world and its strategies for carrying out these ambitions. And we have just learned that its sovereign wealth funds play a crucial part of those strategies, so we should know about them, right? What I most like about Dr. Liu's approach to studying sovereign funds is that she does not abstract sovereign funds from their specific political context. In fact, as her book title suggests, the dilemmas and political goals of China's rulers, that is to say, the Chinese Communist Party, are important to keep in mind when studying the whys and wherefores of China's sovereign funds. Dr. Liu is not just talking about sovereign funds as economic or financial tools, but also as tools of political power. Presumably, we are interested in deriving some lessons from China's sovereign funds experience for the Philippines. And this is where I argue we need to emphasize the differences in political conditions and context between the two countries. China is a very different country from the Philippines. It is a one-party state. That is, a political party with a long-term vision is in control of the country. It is much like Singapore, and the CCP is much like Lee Kuan Yew's People's Action Party, which also use sovereign wealth funds to its political advantage, as well as for the good of the nation. In contrast, many political scientists say the Philippines doesn't even have functioning political parties based on clearly distinguishable ideologies or economic programs. Ironically, the Communist Party of the Philippines, which is the closest thing we have to a true political party, is not part of the normal political system. Rather, Philippine politics is personality-oriented and dominated by dynastic families without any vision beyond their own self-interests. Given the nature of Philippine rulers and the risk of the funds being wasted to corruption by elites, maybe Filipinos should be studying Malaysia's sovereign wealth funds under Najib and Brunei's sovereign wealth fund rather than China's. China's, or again, Singapore's ruling party derives its legitimacy from being able to deliver economically for its people. This means the political interests of the ruling party and the economic interests of ordinary citizens coincide to a large extent. In short, they both want sovereign wealth funds that perform well. Whereas in the Philippines, we can hardly assume that the political interests of the ruling elite and the economic interests of ordinary citizens are identical. In fact, we should probably assume the opposite. In the Philippines, because of decades of elite democracy and neoliberalism, we have so much more irrationality in the way government gains legitimacy, especially in an era rife with disinformation. Even governments with disastrous economic performance can be highly popular. These key differences between China and the Philippines, I suggest, crystallize an important question. Namely, given the lack of long-term vision on the part of the Filipino ruling elite, what, if anything, can ensure that the sovereign wealth fund works for the national interest? Now, one possible answer could be strict legal rules governing the operation of sovereign wealth fund. Many argue that at the minimum, the rules should ensure a certain level of transparency and sound operations of the sovereign wealth fund. These are supposed to be the concern of the so-called Santiago principles prescribed by an IMF World Bank working group. As far as the Maharlika, sorry, my dog. Sorry about my dog. As far as the Maharlika Fund is concerned, however, the Philippines is already past the stage of crafting rules, as the law establishing the Maharlika Fund has already been approved. Unless the Supreme Court throws the law back to Congress, reflecting on what the appropriate rules should be is kind of a moot exercise. In any case, assuming the correct rules can be put in place, they will almost certainly not be enough. We will also have to assume that the people who will run the SWF will follow the rules, at least to a large extent. And that's really a big assumption to make. Strict rules are important, but they are not enough. In our research, we took seriously the divergence between elite and ordinary people's interests in sovereign wealth funds in countries where the risk of corruption is high. Besides the existence of measures ensuring transparency and sound governance of sovereign wealth funds, we highlighted the need for the population to have a sense of ownership or a stake in the fund. So most countries or places with sovereign wealth funds do not bother defining the stake of ordinary people in a sovereign wealth fund, except indirectly in terms of the benefits of economic development. But in Alaska, they give every resident a dividend taken from part of the sovereign wealth fund's earnings, so that Alaskans feel they have a stake in the sovereign wealth fund. Ordinary people have a concrete way of judging that the sovereign wealth fund is working for them. I'm not saying the Philippines can copy the Alaska model wholesale. After all, the Filipino population is 100 times more than the population of Alaska. So paying out substantial dividends to every Filipino is probably not practicable. However, perhaps some kind of direct benefit to ordinary people is required to align elite and ordinary people's interests in sovereign wealth funds. If we are to have a politics or political discourse conducive to an SWF that served the national interest, we may need to take direct benefits seriously. I end here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Jason, sir. And indeed, we appreciate that comparative case approach on the structural differences between the Philippines and China. And I actually concur, sir, that we do have lessons to be learned from Malaysia's one MDB issue. Okay, so we really need to take all these things into account as we go about our very own Maharlika investment fund. Our third and last reactor is Mr. Alexander Escucha. Mr. Alexander Escucha is the president of the Institute for Development and Econometrics Analysis, or IDEA, and is chairman of the UP Visayas Foundation Incorporated. He is a fellow of the Foundation for Economic Freedom and a past president of the Philippine Economic Society. He wrote the handbook on the overview of the business of banking for the Bankers Association of the Philippines on the occasion of its 50th and 60th anniversary in 2014. He has over 40 years of experience in the banking and finance industry, the last 27.5 years of which with China Banking Group, where he retired in December 2021, and where he also served as director of its savings bank subsidiary, and as a member of the Management, Asset Liability, Risk Management, and Technology Steering Committees. He is also an international research director of the Singapore-based The Asian Banker, where he chaired or moderated sessions on banking technology since 2006. He is an advocate of best practice in corporate governance with extensive experience in strategy, communications, technology, and stakeholder or investor relations. Okay, so now may we begin with Mr. Alexander Escucha. Sir, we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this very important forum. Miriam College, Fox Asia, Foundation for National Interest, and Amador Research Services. I have a confession to make. I am now a certified Zoe fan. Zoe, you are my equivalent of Taylor Swift in economic terms. And I've read the whole book almost twice, the first half of which in my iPad and the hard copy. I've also read the transcript of the book launch at the Council for Foreign Relations interview with Shannon O'Neill, and I viewed the video of the interview itself twice. and viewed several of your videos where you are a key guest, like your Ideas Lab session on China's trillion-dollar asset, the Foreign Affairs session on who killed the Chinese economy with Adam Posen and Michael Pettis, and also your session with Columbia University on breaking the dollar's monopoly. It really is a sign of a very brilliant mind, one of which is you talk very fast. But I have 3 pages of notes. I'm not sure whether 10 minutes is enough, but I will just focus on some of the things that were not highlighted. And I would really encourage everyone to read a copy of the book. And I look forward to the day when I can have Zoe sign autograph my copy of the book. Okay. My comments will be in 4 parts. One is, first is key takeaways from the book itself. 2 is the uniqueness of the Chinese model, which is an addition to the taxonomy of, it usually was a distinction between a sovereign wealth fund from surplus and a strategic investment fund from scarcity. And the unique Chinese model is that from sovereign fund to is sovereign leveraged fund. It takes almost a chapter for Zoe to explain the distinction between that and the distinction between explicit and implicit leverage. It's not easy to understand for non-bankers. But I would also contrast the Chinese experience with the possible Maharlika roadmap, what similarities might apply, and let me go later into the thematic lines of thought on the lessons that can be learned from the Chinese experience. I'm very impressed with the scholarship of the book, which is of course a laymanized version of Zoe's PhD dissertation at Johns Hopkins. Research conducted over 8 years and 105 interviews with so many people. And one of the things that, as a banker myself since 1981, going through the 1983 crisis here, post-EDSA 1 and the 1997 crisis, I would like to sort of discuss an item which Zoe had a chapter exclusively for it in the book, but did not discuss in her remarks. And that while CIC, China Investment Corporation, was put up in 2007, there's a prior sovereign fund put up out of the reserve fund, foreign reserves of China, when the benchmark $3 trillion mark was hit in 1997, which is at the onset of the Asian financial crisis. And this is the Central Region Fund. And it was tasked with recapitalizing troubled banks, not only recapitalizing them, reforming them, improving their governance, and eventually actually making them good enough to be sold to the public as listed companies. And there are many of them, but the big 4, some of us know the big 4, ICBC, which is the biggest bank in the world today. I had the privilege of visiting ICBC offices in Beijing in 2002. And even then, it was very impressive. The China Construction Bank, the Bank of China, and the Agricultural Bank of China. In addition to recapitalizing the troubled banks, it went on to recapitalize and revitalize brokerage houses, and then insurance brokerages. And in fact, Central Region ended up as in Zoe's terms, the shareholder in chief of basically the entire Chinese financial sector. In the decoding the geopolitical implications, one of the other book that I've read with a lot of interest is probably Zoe's friend, Winston Ma, who with Douglas Paul Downs, wrote the book The Hunt for Unicorns: How Sovereign Funds Are Reshaping Investment in the Digital Economy. Winston makes the point that to find out exactly what the sovereign funds are doing, you have to follow the money. And Zoe says that exactly in page 5 of the book: follow the money, find the politics. Not only the politics of the global politics intentions of China, especially during Xi Jinping, but even how the domestic politics evolved between Central Beijing, which predated CIC by 10 years, but also the dynamics between the Philippine People's Bank of China, which owned the Central Beijing, and the Finance Ministry, which owned the CIC. Now, on the one thing that is unique about the Chinese experience, and I'm very sort of amazed at this, is that usually in countries, especially in the Netherlands, they have the economists have the term for this, the Dutch disease. When your foreign exchange reserves shut up so much, it strengthens your currency, that it makes the rest of your economy very uncompetitive. That's what happened in the Netherlands, and they call it the Dutch disease. But it's very instructive to see that China was able to sterilize. The economists use this to say, to sterilize when, for example, when our international reserves go up, it results in a higher money supply. And if the central bank does not sterilize that higher money supply, it results in inflation. And it is a big challenge, given that they were talking of trillions of dollars of money, to be able to sterilize that. But precisely, the setting up of a sovereign leverage fund achieved multiple goals in doing so. First, it sterilized the domestic impact of the sovereign funds impact on the monetary supply in China by the Ministry of Finance issuing bonds in RMB and buying and putting that money, buying the dollars from PBOC and putting that money into funding the sovereign leverage funds. So I was able to convert forex financial assets into strategic assets, and it was able to solve the paradox that while China is the biggest commodity exporter in the world, it was accumulating huge surpluses. There's another paradox here that I found, that China has a huge forex surplus, yet its debt to GDP ratio is very high. In fact, as of March 2023, Bloomberg reports that the debt to GDP ratio is 279%. And yet we're here in the Philippines, we're worried about our 60% debt to GDP ratio. And having said that, there was a lot of Zoe documents the evolution of the thinking, both from the economic side and the political side, of how the challenge of whether to use the reserves or not. At first, they were reluctant to do so, but eventually, both at the Ministry of Finance and the PBOC agreed that beyond a certain threshold is no longer optimal to just allow the 80% of the trillions of dollars in China's reserves to be just put in U.S. treasuries. And this brings me to the concept of opportunity cost. In page 13 and page 62, we're talking of item 1 of lower returns per se. In page 62, Zoe quotes Song Hongbin saying that the opportunity cost of keeping this in U.S. treasuries is costing China 4 aircraft carriers a month. Okay, that's a huge That's a huge opportunity cost. Number two, that the realization that are better yields from diversification. But there's an element that I would like to pose to Zoe, because as a banker, we know, especially with the recent experience in the first half of this year, that when the US Fed really increased interest rates, if you're whenever interest rates increase, the value of your securities holdings drop, and that led to the failure, for example, of Silicon Valley Bank. Now, given that China is actually the largest holder of US securities holdings, I can imagine that the mark-to-market losses of China on its US securities holdings would run into the literally hundreds of billions. And I would be interested to know exactly how much that is. Assuming, Zoe, that China also observes the accounting rules according to the IFRS, or the International Financial Reporting System. But the other uniqueness of the model is that in page 39, Zoe quotes Chen Jinhua of the State Commission on Economic System Reform in 1982, combining the visible hand of the state with the invisible hand of the market. And I think 40 years going forward, I think the journey of the sovereign wealth funds they have been able to achieve that. And I think it brings me, Zoe, to the two issues here. The governance issue, because in the governance, there is in the book it says one CIC, two systems. CIC versus SAFE. You have not discussed that. But on the other hand, CIC versus Central Weijin. Central Weijin, as the largest shareholder of banks and financial companies, is not as transparent as CIC. So it leads me to the question: is this a good cop, bad cop model? Because CIC is more transparent. It's signed with the Santiago Principles, but SAFE is more opaque, actually closer to the Singapore GIC model, because GIC, Temasek of Singapore actually scores better than GIC, because while Singapore is known for being very transparent in all its activities, GIC purposely refuses to divulge the contents of its portfolio holdings on the grounds that they don't want other market participants to second guess its investment strategy, which makes sense from certain point of view. So if there's a lesson for us here, one is you said about transparency, and I think CIC is doing very good on this one. I have downloaded the Peterson Institute of International Economics, and they started in 2013 a scorecard for sovereign funds. And in 2013, CIC scored 54, and by 2021, they scored 74, which is actually good compared to the 75 of Mubadala of UAE, 74 of BPI France, higher than 71 of Kazana of Malaysia, 70 of Hong Kong, and 70 of Kuwait, and 64 of GIC. So that's not a bad score. But of course, the gold standard here is Norway, which scored 98 in 2013, and they're not so happy about it. They made sure they scored 100 in the 2021 scoring. So the roles of SLF is very, very strong. But let me go now to what possible comparisons and possible lessons for the Philippines. One is that Central Weijin was initially created as a bailout fund. Its first mission in page 80 was to recapitalize the state-owned commercial banks. And those were really, really bad banks, equal to what happened in the Philippines in 1997, where our NPL ratios were averaging 17 to 20%. But I am you really documented it so well, Zoe, because in page 138, you were very, very forthright in describing that Everbright Bank had a toxic asset ratio of 36.8. But then going forward, Central Region really recapitalized, reformed. Then again, they did the securities brokerage houses, then insurance. But not only that, they not only rescued the banks, they implemented the financial reform and improved government banks. And therefore, it was the sovereign fund that funded, recapitalized the state banks. In the case of Maharlika, it's the opposite. It is the capital of the state bank, Land Bank of the Philippines, and DBP, together with 50 billion maximum from the BSP dividends, which in effect is putting up the seed capital for the sovereign fund. Is it good or bad? In other countries, they actually did not have to involve any of the state banks. India just put in $1 billion at the start for their infrastructure investment fund. But going forward, towards the global security issue, second to the last point is that Zoe mentioned that the definition of warfare, the geopolitical competition is now shifting from the hardware aspect of military war or even weaponry to critical infrastructure, to data, to cyber security. And in fact, Winston Ma's book devoted an entire chapter 8 of this to exactly the same topic, that especially because the book is dedicated towards sovereign funds really going in a very big way towards fintech, because the sovereign funds have funded Uber, Airbnb, and so many of these well-known players now, and they just have started. Now, if I may go to my last point, which is the issue of learning curve and the need for a long view. Definitely, in the Peterson Institute forum, it was said that the Norwegian view of their investment horizon is 100 years. And it is correct that I found funny your anecdote, Zoe, about your cab driver being animatedly exasperated with CIC because he felt a personal connection that they're not using their deploying the money properly. It reminds me of a similar anecdote by Nikolai Tansen, the CEO of the Norwegian fund, Norges Investment Bank. When he started his talk with, I got a letter from a 10-year-old Norwegian girl with 2 coins of Norwegian kroner, and he said, "Dear Nikolai, here are 2 coins. Please take care of my money." And from that anecdote, he says, that is why I take my job of managing this fund very seriously. And then he proceeds on to a very key point, that the important attributes of those who will manage this fund, and even those who will be observing these funds, is patience and humility. Humility, because you will make mistakes. In fact, he said, your goal is to outperform the market. If you do 50%, if you do good 50% of the time, you will be as good as the market. If you outperform the market by 1%, you are going to be very good. And if you outperform the market by 2%, you will be considered a hero. That's 52%. That means you'll be wrong 48% of the time. So I'd like to do that to mention that as a way of, number one, leveling expectations, because even the proponents of the Maharlika Fund are overhyping expectations that to such to such a degree that is practically setting it up to fail against that very high level of expectations. And to Zoe's last 2 points, which is professional management, I agree with that 100%, and transparency and disclosure. I have written a column in the Business World, and I have written 3 pieces already on the Maharlika Fund. And the key points that I can recap there is that Maharlika Fund is a sovereign development fund focused on infrastructure. Number 2, it goes to the several basic questions. Will it work? And I would reframe my answer in the sense that based on the experience of about 40 countries which have done this, the strategic investment funds, not the wealth funds, is that based on the best practice, the short answer is yes. As currently formulated in the law, in IRR, the implementing rules and regulations, and the revised implementing rules and regulations, is it already good to go? The short answer is yes, but there are still major areas for improvement. And that was the point of my second column. There are key key committees there that were not present, like the investment screening committee. However, I also pointed out that the law gave the broad powers to the board, as in any corporation, to create whatever committees necessary to ensure that there is a screening committee to really review and validate the projects on top of whatever is the screening committee screening done by the NEDA board. And my third column was how to prioritize the projects from the universe of 197 infrastructure flagship projects. Already identified which ones are to be funded by the budget, by ODA, Official Development Assistance, and by PPP. And those that are we considered shovel ready, I identified out of the 197 about less than 20 projects which could be a good starting point. With that, I would reserve some other comments and questions in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sir Alexander, for that very thorough and amazing book review of Dr. Liu's book. And yes, sir, I like your characterization of her being the Taylor Swift of the sovereign wealth funds analysis. And I think a notable takeaway indeed, sir, is that follow the money, find the politics. I think that very well applies here to the case of the Philippines. And it would also be good to, as you pointed out, sir, that if there is an international ratings agencies in as far as sovereign wealth funds are concerned, I think it will be helpful in determining the status, legitimacy, and of these sovereign wealth funds. And,
that will be the subject of my fourth column.
Oh, please send me the link, sir, and I would love to read that. And I think the Maharlika Investment Fund will, its success or failure will largely determine the outcome of President Marcos's political capital. Okay, so now we proceed with the more exciting part of our program, which is the open forum. But before that, I was asked by our tech team to take a photo op of our keynote speaker and our reactors. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you don't mind, or lady and gentlemen, if you don't mind, if you open your cameras for a while. Okay. Tech team, please let me know once you've taken a screenshot. Much. Again, let us all give a big hand to our keynote speaker and our reactors. Okay. Let's give them a virtual hand of applause. Okay, so now we proceed with the open forum. But before that, I'd like to give Dr. Liu a brief opportunity to respond to the comments of the reactors. Briefly, if you don't mind, if you would want to, ma'am, would you like to comment on the comments of the reactors?
Sure, just very briefly. I think all the three reactors comment. I do learn a lot to begin with. I do learn a lot, some similarities in terms of how Philippines sovereign funds started the vision and the source of financing. And I'm also relieved, to be honest, to realize that there are so many talented and highly capable people are watching how this is going to move forward. So this is a good sign. And then secondly, I'm really grateful for Mr. Alex and for everybody's interest in this research. I remember when I was working on my doctoral thesis, I really did not start as a finance person. I started as energy person. I wanted to study cross-border pipelines and specifically natural gas. I was curious at which point, what are the factors making natural gas, liquefied natural gas on a tanker versus building a pipeline. So that, and then 1 year into my project, somebody else did exactly the same topic, and that person was 3 years ahead of me. So I decided that I had to pivot. So then the question for me is, well, all these all these commodity exporting countries, they have a loss of resource revenue. Then the problem becomes like, how do they recycle the money? So that's the sort of like a petrodollar recycle system. And then from there, I discovered sovereign wealth fund and how they manage this. So the natural puzzle becomes, well, it's so weird that China, being the largest energy importing country, has sovereign wealth fund. And then the China part is now published, but then the other part, when I compared China and the other fund, and specifically comparing foreign exchange reserve management between China and Japan, that's where actually finding the politics really comes out. In Japan, being the second largest foreign exchange reserve holding country in the world, Ministry of Finance of Japan rejected the idea of using sovereign wealth fund or using foreign exchange reserves to capitalize a Japanese sovereign wealth fund. But what they did was to use foreign exchange reserves to recapitalize and support Japan Bank for International Cooperation, JBEC, which now is a very important strategic investment institution owned by the Japanese government. And they conducted a lot of similar things that safe affiliated investment funds are doing. So from that perspective, I do think there are a lot of lessons in terms of there is a fine line, and I think all our three reactors correctly pointed out, and perhaps have way much more knowledge than I do in the context of Philippines. The fine line between the government crowd out or overreach versus the government can actually play a helping hand. So I guess I'll just stop there. And I wanted to say that I'm extremely grateful for your time and for your interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liu. So again, for our participants, you may post your questions in the Q&A chat box. And actually, there are already some questions, ma'am. And the first one is, how safe is China's sovereign wealth funds in terms of financial stability, to include market risk whenever foreign investors transfer their business elsewhere?
I guess the question is regards to when China invests in a foreign country, how does the institutions manage the investment risk? And because you're doing business in a foreign country, right? If I understand that question correctly. So I think this is a superb question, and I do struggle this with when doing the research. So when in the book, I do compare the financial returns of China Investment Corporation versus its peers, and both as well as its domestic portfolio versus its global portfolio. So from that perspective, in terms of financial returns, CIC is actually just really mediocre, and across the years, very rarely its return is even higher than, or most of the time, its return is lower than the S&P 500. But that is not unusual, because if you think about it, pure market-based investors would their optimization function, capital allocation optimization function, is relatively simple in that you just chase return maximization, you focus on ROI. Whereas for sovereign funds, particularly in the context of China, they have additional variables in the optimization function. You can call it constraint, or you can call it additional factor to consider. And these are sometimes highly related to the areas where the government prioritize. So from that perspective, and then obviously, the investment horizon is different. So, but overall, I would say China's sovereign funds, at least in terms of financial returns, even for the years that they lost money, it was paper loss. It was not, as long as they did not divest when they were making making paper value loss, it's still not materialized. But as we are moving forward today in the world today we are living in now, when the West, in particular United States and its allies in like Canada or members of the European Union, started to be more cautious about the strategic nature or the strategic motivation of China's state-owned institutional investors exporter or investing, in particular investing in their strategic companies. They started to ask questions, and they started to do two things. One is investment screening, making it even more difficult for Chinese investors to invest in America, in Germany, Italy, or France. Or the second part would be divesting. You already started to see that a Canadian government forced Chinese owners to divest from their mines. You also see China the Italian tire company Pirelli, which was a company financed or supported. The investment was made by a state-owned Chinese chemical company, but the finance was facilitated by CIC. And then again, Italy was starting to ask questions like saying that, well, no, you probably wouldn't want to consider divest. So from that perspective, although there has not necessarily been tremendous amount of money lost. I mean, actually from $200 billion to more than 200 billion to 1.2 trillion. They made a lot of money over the years, but the strategic risk going forward and the divesting risk because of geopolitical tensions going forward probably would be more challenging for China. And those are something that Chinese sovereign funds cannot easily address themselves. But in response to that, they have been developing mechanisms to mitigate this. And the way that they mitigate this kind of risk is to set up joint ventures. That's where legal structures and a lot of the lawyerly work started to be very important. It matters how you structure the deal so that it becomes, at least from a regulatory perspective, the investment is not a foreign alien. So again, investment now is very much is less about finance. In fact, finance is important, but actually lawyerly work is even more important.
Zoe,
Okay.
if I may interject,
Yes,
put you a
sir.
bit more on the spot, because this speaks to the issue of what have we learned and what has China learned. You wrote at length, including Winston Ma, that CIC invested pre-IPO into Blackstone, a big name in U.S. Investment banking, in 2007. But then the 2008 global financial crisis happened, and there were certainly major losses. And then it exited in 2008. Do you have a final figure exactly how did they make out in net terms? Because this corresponds to your point in page 143 and 144 with the chart. The CIC performed worse than S&P. It failed to exceed the cost of capital, and the global portfolio was short of break-even rate half the time.
Yes. I think, Sir Alex, you are now you know the research better than I do. I don't even remember the page number. But I emphasize, I think the investment in Blackstone is important for two reasons at least. The first reason is that that was the first time that a China's foreign exchange asset was first used to invest in a Western territory. So that was important. And they strategically chose Blackstone. Part of the reason is because they wanted to have access to the best and the most brilliant financial expertise. Because when CIC was first established, they had less than a dozen people managing $200 billion asset. That is a lot of money that they really didn't have the experience. So they needed the financial expertise, and actually those financial expertise over the years paid out. If you think about it, Mr. Steven Schwarzman, he's a very fine finance professional, and then he actually became a very important scholarly exchange supporter between the United States and China, the Schwarzman's program and all that. So that's the first one, financial expertise. And then obviously in the context of the United States, Chinese policymakers also see Mr. Schwarzman as a sort of one of the few people who can deliver message to top leaders, top policymakers in the United States directly. And President Xi Jinping recognized that. He met with him on the sidelines of Davos. So from that perspective, that relationship is very well invested, despite the paper loss in the early years. And then the second reason why I emphasize this paper law is because CIC really did not relinquish or did not divest their shareholding in Blackstone, despite that when Blackstone went on IPO, Steven Schwarzman and Peter Peterson, they both divested their own shares, right? So it's, again, finance 101. If you think your stuff is undervalued, you hold on to it, you don't divest. But the founder divested right at the time when CIC did the pre-IPO subscription. So that's an interesting sign. I do not question their judgment, but I think it's interesting, the timing, the way that they did it. But CIC really did not divest until 2018, and by that time, the share price, if I remember it correctly, they at least increased by at least 10%. So from that perspective, they actually, if you think about, is actually a decent investment. You did not lose money, and you also build friends.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I hope
Thank
that
you.
answers your question. But again, Sir Alex, you probably know my research better than myself. I really don't remember the page numbers, but you do. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Alex and Dr. Liu. Dr. Liu, there's a related question to that. You talked about lawyers and legal parameters, right? So the question is, what safeguards were put in place by the Chinese government to dissuade corruption in China's sovereign funds? What are these safeguards?
That's a good question. They do have their own sort of management system, and it's very in terms of how they manage deter corruption. Part of that is the self-governance. They have their own charter in terms of these are how we are going to govern ourselves. But then on the other hand, outside of the company, you also have the parties inspection commission. So in other words, you have rules is governing the company, and then you also have the party which provide a sort of supervision inspection function, and also a very important function would be HR function. At a certain level, higher level position, it has to be approved by the parties human resource management department, basically the party's HR. And I remember there was this one particular case just showing that how serious they are with regard to anti-corruption. There was one. It's before President Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign and all that. They do this actually through a serious audit. Although people may question China's auditing system and all that, but there was 1 year they did audit, and it's the party has sent a separate team to inspect the works of CIC, and they detected that a lot of these senior managers, they were using company money. They basically build the companies for their golf time, and that becomes a problem. So so basically at that time, the CIC chairman he sent out a very serious note and criticized those people and asked those people to say that you have to apologize, you have to write like self-inspection and basically acknowledge your wrongdoing. So this might be some sort of like, you can interpret this as a sort of formality, but then I think it showcases that at least we recognize this is a problem. But then in the broader scheme, I would say that perhaps there are even more serious form of corruption than, say, billing the company for golfing. I think many other investment banks perhaps did that at a certain point. So in terms of, if the question is with regard to do they have specific guidelines, do they have specific written rules to say these are how we are going to do in terms of anti-corruption. I do not see that. I do not see that in terms of specific guidelines in terms of preventing corruption, but it's implied. And then finally, specifically for CIC, it has, in terms of governance, it has, on the one hand, one of our responders already mentioned that CIC's global part, or is a voluntary signatory to the San Diego Principle, and that is good in terms of higher level of transparency. You sort of adhere to international standard, and you are a member of the IMF's International Sovereign Wealth Fund Forum. So those are good, but those only applies to CIC's international branch, and its domestic branch, Central Huijin, is a different story. It is far less transparent, and it did not even release annual report until a few years ago. But then again, if the question is how much corruption is there with regard to Central Huijin, I do not know. I really don't have an answer, but because I don't have the number. But if you look at how many high-level finance person have fall victim during the anti-corruption campaign in the past few years, and even recently, you realize it's actually a pretty serious problem.
If I may follow through that, Zoe,
Yes,
you don't mind?
yes, sir, Alex, you can, and perhaps our
because,
other reactors may follow as well, jump in as well. Yeah.
Yes, on this, no? Because talking about lessons, one phrase, Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs was very instrumental in the corruption-ridden scandal of 1MDB. And they ended up paying $4.5 billion to the Malaysian government for the role in that fiasco. But at the same time, it depends on how you manage your partner, because Zoe wrote that CIC had a JD strategy with Goldman Sachs, where Goldman Sachs actually facilitated the approval in the US Congress of an acquisition of Boyd Corporation before the Committee on Foreign Investments in the US, or CFIUS. In other sessions, Zoe, you're referring that the hurdle of getting CFIUS approval is a relatively tough issue, and I think CIC has handled it well by making Goldman Sachs an ally in this particular transaction.
Yeah. Dr. Zoe, would you like to say something about
Sure.
that?
Yes, I think this is a point where it becomes tricky, right? Is that the case with CIC's relationship with Goldman Sachs? That relationship started from it was a product during President Trump's visit to China back in 2017. So in a way, it's a sort of a a gift in a way, both for China, CIC, and for President Xi Jinping is a sort of, and for Goldman Sachs in a way. But but that is in the bigger context of CIC's evolution, because it recognized the greater hurdle coming from the West in terms of investment screening. That's what inbound investment screening. Starting from 2015, even the Germans, after a Chinese company acquired their top-tier robotic company, they started to freak out. Why we could not find a sovereign funds of our own to deter undesired foreign investment. And that basically was the context in which now the European Union started to say that they need their own sovereign funds for the purpose of protecting their strategic industries, deter undesired investment, and so on and so forth. But obviously, Philippines sovereign funds would be a different story for different purposes. But the CIC's partnership with Goldman Sachs, really the joint venture made it possible for CIC to invest in the United States, because from a regulatory perspective, the argument can be made saying that this joint venture CIC, although the money was from CIC, but CIC does not have any degree of control of how the money is invested and so on and so forth. So from a regulatory perspective, this can be defined, this investment, this transaction can be defined as a domestic entity rather than a domestic person, rather than a foreign alien. So as long as it's not a foreign alien, then the problem solved. So to what extent this is, so there is a difference between Goldman Sachs involvement in 1MDB scandal, siphon off the money, versus this case. But then again, I think the fine line is important, and it matters who is sitting on top. If you get the right person, great. If you unfortunately, if you didn't get the right person and siphon off the money for other type of works, and in particular in the context of infrastructure projects are notorious for opportunities of corruption. So perhaps knowing that there are so many experts here paying a lot of attention and actually knows how these funds should be managed, I think all the participants today here, you should at least be either on the advisory board or manage the fund.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Liu. I think we're running out of time, so we'd like to know if there are more questions from the audience, and if our other reactors would also like to jump in and comment as well. Dr. Jason and Dr. JC, if you have something
I'm
to
good,
say.
Aaron. I'm good.
All right, sir. Okay. And actually, I do have a question, Dr. Liu, because when we talk about Chinese foreign economic policy, we've heard a lot about things like the Belt and Road Initiative, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the BRICS Bank, the New Development Bank, the BRICS Bank, and the most recently Global Development Initiative. Why haven't we heard a lot about these sovereign wealth funds? They're not as pronounced as the other development initiatives and economic regimes of China. Why do you think that is?
That's a good question. I think, if you ask me about sovereign funds, perhaps in 2013, I probably would not know that China actually is an important player. Part of the reason I think is that they are, it's a niche area of research that people don't necessarily pay a lot of attention to, in particular for political scientists. And I had a hard time organizing my committee members, but I ended up having a great committee member, great dissertation committee, and I was fortunate to have the opportunity to interview a lot of people. And then I also recognized that the field of study itself, as a political scientist or economist, or in particular, or for that matter, international political economy, a lot of these focuses have been on trade, international trade or international monetary system. The idea of the politics or the political economy of a cross-border capital flow, I think is really something fairly new. And perhaps this is the reflection of the process of globalization, the formation of a global market, the trade, good market, service market has been starting from Columbus' discovery of the New World. But financial globalization perhaps is something very new since perhaps the 2000s. So there is that. And then finally, I think it's the nature of China's sovereign funds or the entire world of sovereign funds themselves, they are big players, but they tend to be low key. You do not see sovereign funds, the head of sovereign funds jump out and make crazy comment, and they should not, because part of that is accountability, and then part of that is a serious job, as Sir Alex mentioned. It's a serious job that a lot is at stake. And then finally, I would just say that perhaps there is also a knowledge gap in terms of the influence of how China evolved, because China, for a long period of time, our impression of China has been, it's made in China, it's low value added, and its contribution to the world is toys and umbrellas or shoes. But now China has become the largest creditor to a lot of countries. So from that perspective, this is a relatively new phenomenon for China, but scholarly researchers tend to lag behind the reality.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Zoe. And so we really appreciate you bringing this topic to the discourse. And I think it's no surprise that your work will be a landmark literature when it comes to sovereign wealth funds, especially Chinese sovereign wealth funds. So I believe we're run out of time. So again, let's all give a big hand to our keynote speaker, Dr. Liu, and to our reactors. Thank you very much. So on behalf of Facts Asia, Miriam College, Amador Research Services, and the Foundation for the National Interest, we wish to express our warm regards to our speakers and participants for a very fruitful discussion. We hope to see you all in the next installment of our webinar series. So if you have questions or concerns, you can reach us on our Facebook account, LinkedIn, and also Twitter accounts. Those who need a certificate of attendance, please be informed that you will need to accomplish this evaluation survey. So please have a look at the chat box and then for the post-event survey and answer them. So once again, I'm Aaron Jed Rabena, and thank you all so much for your participation. Maraming salamat po and have a good day.